Hello and welcome to Global Eye. This is Parikshit Luthra. South Africa is all set to host the 15th BRICS Summit next week in Johannesburg. Also the first in-person meeting of the members since the pandemic. Around 40 leaders, including Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Xi Jinping, Cyril Ramaphosa, Lula da Silva of Brazil will attend the summit. Russian President Vladimir Putin will attend virtually due to an arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court. The primary focus of this year's BRICS Summit will be on expanding the group's membership. Over 20 countries, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, have expressed interest in joining BRICS. During a phone call on Thursday, Putin spoke to his Iranian counterpart for the possible inclusion of Iran in the grouping. Another key focus will be on establishing a common currency to curb the rising dominance of the US dollar. To further understand the significance of the summit, we're joined by Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, Katherine Hadda, chair of the US-India Policy Studies Center at the Center for Strategic Studies, and also joined by strategic affairs expert Brahma Chellaney. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Katherine, if I may begin with you, how concerned is the US about the possible expansion of the BRICS under China's supervision?
Well, first of all, namaskar, Parikshit. It's nice seeing you again, and hello to your viewers as well. I don't speak for the U.S. government right now, but I would be surprised if we see much of a reaction from the government at all, and I think that's very appropriate. Firstly, it's true that the BRICS, convene as sort of a countermeasure to a U.S., what they perceive as a U.S.-dominated world system, but it really remains a very aspirational organization. And just given the two main policy topics that you raised, the unified currency and expanding membership. As far as I read it, India is really not in favor of a unified currency at this time, largely because, the world has really changed since the countries first came together 15 years ago. And India, while it continues to be a standard bearer of the global South and very proudly independent in foreign affairs, is also much more concerned about China's role in the region and China's role in the global economy and global political system than it may have been in 2009, given border tensions and other reasons. So, and anything that gives more weight to the yuan, which this would, the Chinese yuan, I think India will continue to oppose. In terms of membership, I think maybe the opposition for India is less strident, but it will take a vetting process to ensure balance in the organization doesn't tilt notably to China. So for those reasons, I think BRICS is seen as kind of aspirational by the United States, and it's much more, if I were advising the government right now, I would say it's much more important for the administration, the Biden administration, to project confidence and optimism as they're doing, for example, with the summit with Japan and South Korea, and as they did with Prime Minister Modi's highly successful state visit to Washington in June.
Right. Let me now go across to Brahma Chellaney. Brahma Chellaney, we just heard about a conversation between the president of Iran and Prime Minister Modi, and this is ahead of the BRICS meeting that takes place next week. Iran, of course, is keen on joining BRICS as a grouping. Is India comfortable with the idea of expansion? China and Russia, of course, want an expanded BRICS to counter the dominance of the West, the US and Europe. How comfortable is China with this entire exercise? We've caused for positive discussions, transparent discussions.
Well, first, the BRICS is the first major non-Western global initiative, but it has long struggled to build a common identity and agenda. But in the wake of the Ukraine war and the West's weaponization of finance, BRICS is gaining new momentum. Countries are planning to join BRICS, including Western allies like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Argentina. They've applied to join BRICS, which is quite a surprise. And then we are seeing this de-dollarizing trend to some extent. And in that context, some have suggested a new shared BRICS currency. The issue is that before you expand an important initiative like BRICS, shouldn't BRICS become a more cohesive initiative? Shouldn't it build common positions so that it represents a unified voice in international forums. If you look at, for example, even in the realm of global financial architecture, the existing BRICS economies have thus far failed to develop a unified position on the specific changes they desire in the global financial architecture or in the IMF's quota and governance system, or even the World Bank's structure. So if 5 countries are unable to build common positions on important issues, imagine if BRICS becomes a grouping of, let's say, 28 countries, because 23 have applied now. So if it becomes a grouping of 28 countries, it'll become virtually impossible to build common positions. Therefore, before you enlarge, build some cohesion and unified positions.
Right. Ambassador Bhatia, coming to you now, what's your sense on issues such as unified currency? It seems to be a long-term endeavor. Also on increased funding for the new development bank. Do you see some headway being made next week?
Thank you very much. I think on the issue of currency, I would be quite candid, and I would say that there's been a lot of excitement in the media, but is there accuracy in reporting on this issue? I doubt it. I think this whole concept of a common currency for BRICS or a BRICS currency is completely overstated. There is hardly any possibility of BRICS leadership agreeing on a common currency, because common currency is the end product of a very close and sophisticated financial integration in the economies of the 5 member countries. We are nowhere close to it. What the BRICS governments are trying to do is to use more and more national currencies in their bilateral trade transactions, and that is certainly bound to increase. So we should be very clear in terms of recognizing that while there is growing trends for cooperation in trade, investment, and other financial domains, common BRICS currency is really not on the agenda, as the host government too has been saying again and again and again. That is the basic thing. If you allow me, just very quickly, I also want to touch the expansion issue. There's been great excitement on that. But the fact is that the 5 governments have in principle agreed to expansion. So certainly India is one of the 5 countries. But they are completely, focused on developing a criteria which will really define, the characteristics and features of new members. And right now, as we reach the final phase in the negotiations, my information is they are finalizing the criteria, and therefore we will have to simply wait until the summit leaders meet and declare their decision.
Right. Let me go back to Katherine at this point. Katherine, as far as the role of Russia here is concerned, BRICS is one of those groupings apart from SCO where Russia would like to continue having influence. How would the US be watching out for Russia's role over here during BRICS, and what kind of support do you expect President Putin to ask for from China and other nations?
Well, you'll have to ask the Russians what President Putin is going to ask for, I think. But what I would say the reaction might be is a cautious reaction. And you can see it not only in South Africa's, lack of an invitation, or that he, I guess, voluntarily bowed out so they wouldn't have the dilemma of having to arrest him because of the ICC warrant, but also the fact that Russia hasn't been able to tap the $100 billion fund because none of the neighbors, other members want to antagonize the global financial system by going against sanctions. So again, there are limits to what this grouping is going to do. I think what your other speaker said is exactly correct. They need to come together cohesively as a grouping first. before this group is expanded in a productive way or can do anything tangible. So what I would expect the outcome for this particular summit will be is more like what happened last year, where there's a nice but somewhat bland statement that's, again, highly aspirational rather than concrete.
Right. Ambassador Bhatia, coming to you, when it comes to having the support of China, having the support of Russia just ahead of G20, one of the primary reasons why the Prime Minister has made it a point to travel for BRICS is because he wants to ensure that everyone comes, there is consensus on some of the major issues of our times at the G20. How important will this meeting be for the Prime Minister? And do you think if he meets President Xi Jinping over here, it will be a crucial meeting which sets the tone for the G20 also in a way?
Yes, that is a very crucial question facing BRICS Summit, how Indian and Chinese leaders will connect on all the central issues affecting BRICS, on the prospects of a joint communique for G20, and eventually even on bilateral relationship. I think it's a positive sign that both our Prime Minister and President of China will be in Johannesburg. They are bound to be opportunities for exchanges, interactions, possibly a bilateral meeting, although that has not yet been confirmed. And at that point, they will, in the same order, focus on bringing convergence on BRICS issues. But certainly, I think it will be a major effort and interest and concern of the Indian government to make sure that the way is smoothed for the finalization of Delhi Declaration of G20. As you know, there's only one issue, one principal issue on which Russia and China do not seem to agree with the rest of the 18 G20 countries, and that is the famous 2 Bali paragraphs on Ukraine. So I think we can be reasonably hopeful that something will work out on that. Finally, on the bilateral issues, India, China, the LAC and the peace and tranquility in the Western sector, we are all watching very closely the developments in the last few days. And I think the next 3 or 4 days are very, very crucial. And if you just give me 1 minute, I wanted to also answer the question which I could not in the first instance, and that was the question you asked very professionally, which is the new development bank of BRICS. New development bank is a major important success of this grouping. It is still not a very big player as compared to the other multilateral development banks, but it is important enough with the overall capital base of $100 billion. And they have already allocated a significant amount of this on various projects. So I feel that we must focus a little bit more how NDB can be recapitalized, that is how its capital expansion can take place, and that is where the question of the expansion of the membership of BRICS comes in as well. So let us see how it works out.
All right. We've run out of time, Ambassador Bhatia. We've run out of time, but thank you very much to you, Katherine Hadda and Brahma Chellaney for joining us on the program. We're going to take a short break, but we will request Brahma Chellaney to stay with us because we would be talking about Chinese real estate giant Evergrande filing for bankruptcy, the slowdown in the Chinese economy, and what it means, not just for China, but for the world as well. Don't go anywhere. A special discussion on the other side with our guests. Welcome back. You are watching Global Eye. We are discussing the economic slowdown in China. China's economy is witnessing a crisis of confidence. The world's most indebted real estate company, Evergrande, has filed for bankruptcy protection in a U.S. court in a bid to seek a restructuring deal. The company has sought protection under Chapter 15 of the Bankruptcy Code, which will protect its assets in the U.S. Let me now go across to our guests right now. We're joined by close China watcher and strategic affairs expert, Brahma Chellaney, and we're also joined by Zongyuan Zoe Liu, Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Brahma Chellaney, coming to you first. the crisis that we're seeing with Evergrande, how do you think this property crisis, this filing for bankruptcy in the US, could really spread to other aspects of the property sector in China and the Chinese economy as well?
The real estate slump in China is part of the larger economic crisis in China. And the economic crisis, in turn, is linked to long-term structural constraints that China is beginning to face. And these structural constraints are quite fundamental. For example, a shrinking and rapidly aging population, slowing growth in productivity, high debt level. You look at China's demographic crisis, that's deepening even as China remains a developing country as measured by workers' average incomes. Now, these structural constraints could put a check on China's overweening ambition to become the world's #1 power. And it has, as we all know, this economic crisis carries global implications given the fact that China is the world's factory floor. So whatever happens in China is going to affect the global economy. But the fact is that it'll be very difficult for China to come out of the present economic crisis given the long-term structural constraints it's beginning to face.
Right. Ms. Liu, coming to you, how do you see some of the steps taken by the Chinese government so far to address this economic crisis? Because experts around the world feel that no one is immune, and this slowdown in China could have ripple effects in the months to come.
Parikshit, you are right that international investors has the legitimate right to be concerned about the financial contagion, or whether this is potentially a layman moment for China that might have ripple effect to the global financial market. And so far, I would want to take a step back by saying that a lot of these financial contagion concerns comes from not just the real estate sector, but really about how these sectors have been financed. And a lot of these stories comes down to the shadow banking system, and in particular, the trust industry. Right now, the trust industry is about $2.9 trillion in China, and the Chinese regulators have long been thinking about how to get a grip of it. But so far, we really haven't seen enough in terms of increase the transparency of it. And related to that is also the another relatively untransparent sector, which is the local government financing vehicle, which is, again, deeply related to the local government debt. And that is another aspect of lack of transparency in Chinese financial system.
All right. I would also like to ask you, as far as the property crisis go, how is this likely to affect jobs in China, other sectors of the Chinese economy?
In terms of the effect on jobs, I would say so far the property market crackdown really had the direct impact, yes, is on the property market, but it created a deeper dam on the confidence level of both Chinese consumers as well as international investors' confidence in China. As a result, you see not just the Chinese household spending less, but also entrepreneurship inside China, as well as the international investors' confidence in China have sort of slided. And this actually have a very negative impact on the employment outlook. And so far, it seems that the Chinese government not only paused publishing consumer confidence index since April, most recently, they also paused updating youth unemployment number.
Right. Mr. Chellaney, coming back to you, when it comes to protests, we have seen how the Evergrande crisis has also triggered some protests in parts of China. How do you see protests in China taking place currently due to the economic conditions?
Well, first, the real estate sector in China makes up about 20 to 24% of China's GDP. So the crisis in the real estate sector really is a major crisis that President Xi Jinping is confronting. Xi Jinping seems to be in a hurry to achieve what he calls the Chinese dream, or China's global preeminence, largely because of the fact that China is beginning to face structural constraints, an economic slowdown, a demographic crisis, a declining productivity. So he seems to be a man in a hurry. He believes that China has a narrow window of strategic opportunity to modify the international order in its favor before it confronts a deeper demographic crisis, stalled economic growth, and an unfavorable global climate. You know, the Chinese economy benefited from decades of favorable global environment. And actually, that free ride is coming to an end now. So we are seeing Xi Jinping signaling an increasing appetite for taking risks. So in that context, when protests happen domestically, the effort will be to clamp down harshly. And we saw, during these protests against zero COVID, the zero COVID protests were quite a surprise in terms of the scale on the scale on which they happened. They began spontaneously. There were youth-led protests in Beijing and Shanghai and some other major cities, and it took the Chinese leadership by utter surprise. And the Chinese leadership then, once it got its act together, then cracked down quite harshly on the protests. And we're going to see a similar trend that, where they're taken by surprise, these protests will happen. And then, once they get their act together, these protests will be crushed.
All right, we've run out of time, but Ms. Liu and Brahma Chellaney, thank you very much on this program. We'll keep out for the Chinese economic situation in the months to come, but lots to expect next week. The BRICS Summit is all set to take place. There will be the China-Africa Summit as well that we will be watching out for. And let's not forget the G20 Leaders Summit on the 9th and 10th of September that the world will be watching very closely. That's all we have time for. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.